All right, everyone, welcome. So this is part two of our Constitution chapter. So it'll be listed as 2.2 on the actual post on Google Classroom. And then you'll also notice that this specifically goes from slides 9 all the way till 19. So what we got into last time is with the Articles of Confederation. And ultimately, with the Articles of Confederation, and as we see with things like Shays Rebellion, it didn't the federal government that was established by the Articles did not have enough authority to enforce the powers, and anything went wrong within the states. And so this and other things like the Whiskey Rebellion and a couple of other events that do happen inspire this concept of, you know what, maybe we should rethink what we're doing. Maybe the current Articles of Confederation and the power that they offer is not enough to truly enforce this new nation. And so bring in 1787, the summer of 1887 was actually the hottest summer in 100 years. So I just think of things like, there's no air conditioning in this building, all these kind of stinky men in the hottest summer, and that does not sound like a fun experience. But what does this look like? Okay, so in the summer, we're going to have delegates from 12 states. No one from Rhode Island shows up, and so you have 55 individuals in here. George Washington is the one that is the chair over the convention. And one thing to understand is that all the delegates really represent a lot of this elite and class theory that we discussed in the first chapter. And it's important to understand that because these are the landowners, these are the ones that will make the decisions going forward, and understand that the concept of wealth at this time is a little bit different than like the post-industrial revolution. Wealth is defined as land ownership, and most of these men all owned land, and that will play a factor in the voting as well. But just giving you kind of an idea of this Philadelphia Convention, and when they're trying to meet, they're basically saying that, okay, the Articles of Confederation were a good try. Federally, the strong, national government doesn't do much, but we're also not in the mode of let's try over and let's make almost to the point of a monarchy. And so this is, the idea of the Jeffersonian democracy. We're going to try it again, that you can have yeoman farmers who are able to own their own land and have like upward mobility, but we still don't want like a monarchy. And so the concept of a limited democracy, as much democracy as is necessary, is good. Otherwise, the government's best role is to butt out and actually not get involved, because that's when the freedoms get infringed upon, is when they intervene. So during this summer, what are they talking about? And understand that a lot of this is actually done in private, but Washington is chosen as the chair, which means he is the unbiased party to get the kind of the rules of procedure through, having different people given different times of speaking and things like that. And as the proceedings held in secret, I think that this is important specifically because this is a government that's being created for the people, by the people, of the people, and the people are not invited. These delegates are not all necessarily elected officials, although most of them are. Some of them are former elected officials. But this is not being broadcast to the media, and I suppose that's the wrong word, but the media is not there. They're not writing pamphlets about it, and ultimately these deliberations are basically held in secret. I just think that's pretty ironic. Okay, so how are we going to do this? We basically need to get rid of the Articles of Confederation, and so the way that we're going to do that is if we can give each state their one vote, and we have them vote. If we can get 9, then we can agree that we will get rid of the Articles of Confederation. Now, the difficulty of that is basically you create a constitution, the Articles, that say it will live in perpetuity. It will live forever, and they have a way to get rid of it. So to sum this up, Article 13 says you can get rid of it, but only if both Congress says yes and if each state ratifies. But that's not what we did. We didn't have Congress decide, because in order to amend the Constitution, you need 13 out of 13, and when Rhode Island doesn't show up, that's going to make it very difficult. So, you know what? Skip that part. We don't need to actually do this part where Congress needs to vote, but we'll just do this ratification part. And so technically speaking, getting rid of the articles was kind of an extra legal decision that makes their standing within law kind of dubious. So what within the deliberations, what are the plans? What are the options? So we agree that the articles don't work, but should we get rid of it totally? Should we modify it? Should we add in different things? And so a couple of ideas coming in. Madison is one of the main architects of the Constitution. And so Madison comes in and he says ultimately the national government, when we have a federal system where you have state and federal and local jurisdiction, it's the federal government that, when in doubt, ultimately should rule over. And so that's this veto power. We're not talking like a presidential veto. We're talking about if the states make two laws that are intersecting and don't really jive together, ultimately the Supreme government, the national government, would be at the top. And that's all it means by supreme. So when we say Supreme Court, we just mean the top court. So that's one part. Not necessarily an executive, but that the national government would have more power than, say, a state government. And then the other thing that Madison offered is having a bicameral legislature, similar in composition to in Great Britain, House of Commons, lower house, the House, and then the House of Lords is the upper house, the Senate. And then the other thing that he put in here was the separation of powers and the checks and balances. And so you would have a legislative branch that has two chambers, and then you would also have an executive branch to execute and enforce the laws, and then you would have a judiciary independent of the other branches, and they would rule on lawsuits. And so if the state of Maryland says one thing and the state of Virginia says another, ultimately the courts, the federal courts, can step in and kind of attest to what should happen. And then as far as the executive ensures that laws passed by Congress are drawn out and helping engage in treaties. So the president can engage in a treaty, but the Senate has to approve it. President is the commander-in-chief, but the Congress has to approve war, things like that. And we'll get into more of the checks and balances too. And then the other part of Madison's main plan is, as the Virginia plan, it really stresses the idea of the House based on population, and really, that's going to be favorable towards the large states like Virginia. And so when you're referring back to the Virginia plan, do think of the size geographically of Virginia compared to the other one we'll talk about, which is New Jersey. But Madison is the main architect of this. And when he actually offered a bicameral legislature, he really meant one senator in the Senate. And what's fascinating, and I didn't know this that long ago, is that Madison actually stormed out of the Constitutional Convention because of so much talk about having more than one senator. And actually, we have records of him predicting a lot of the gridlock that we see in the Senate today based on that too. So that's one side, right? So that's like one, you call them working blocks. So it's like different groups within the committee start to form common ideas. So you have like Madison's Virginia plan. That's like one group you could join. But other people say, you know what, it's not enough. It's not enough to protect the small states. And so they really bring in this idea of a unicameral legislature, no House, just a Senate. And that one Senate would be one state, one vote. And Madison's idea of the Virginia plan is one state, one vote for the Senate, but then you have a second chamber that's based on proportion. But understand that with the New Jersey plan too, is it talks about the power of the federal government to reacquire funds from the states, meaning that the federal government can tax the states. And that's something that wasn't really in the Articles of Confederation, and I think this actually kind of ties to the idea of having the federal government have supreme power over the land. And then the other thing too is it does create this balance. So yes, I mean the feds can tax the states. However, for anything just happening in New Jersey, that's up to the New Jersey government, the governor, the state assembly, the state senate, and things like that. And so ultimately, while it does give federal power in a little bit, it also remains that kind of sovereignty to the state itself. And so, so that's that point. And then again, just like the Virginia plan, big state geographically, big population is that's what the bigger states want. The New Jersey plan is what the smaller states want. And so We will merge these, and the merging we call the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise. So to go back just to recap, you have the Virginia Plan, national supremacy. Okay, this is something that will make it in. A bicameral legislature with checks and balances, that makes it in. And then as far as the New Jersey plan, we don't go with the unicameral. We don't go with the one state, one vote. We do have the feds have the ability to tax the states. And we do have state specific things that are in state control, and that is present as well. And so bringing it together, we basically take most of the Virginia plan and add maybe a couple of things in from the New Jersey plan. But one of the main things that's created is a House of Representatives based on population. This is Steny Hoyer, who's the majority leader. And within the House of Representatives, the lower chamber, direct election from the people, and this would be based on population. Now, how we determine the population, especially with the issue of slavery, is something we'll come back to. But just know that the Connecticut Compromise is what creates the House, one chamber, and then the Connecticut Compromise also creates a U.S. Senate. And the compromise here is Madison said, no, we need one senator per state, but the compromise ends up being 2 senators per state, regardless of population. And notice that these senators are chosen by the state legislature. So you, the citizen, you would vote for your state senator, and then your state senator would choose Mitch McConnell, but you do not get a direct vote. And that's the elite class theory as well. You get direct vote in the House of Reps, that's participatory. But the fact that until the 1900s, you cannot elect your own senators is evidence of that elite class theory. And so what we see today is the Connecticut Compromise. And that's based on the deliberations that went through the Constitutional Convention. So a couple of other components. I mentioned checks and balances, but we also want to talk about something like divided government. And so what do we do about dividing up the powers? Some powers are shared. Do certain powers have only powers given to them? How much do they overlap? And this is where it gets very gray. And this is where we try and interpret the Constitution, because, things like with the executive, okay, the executive has the power to create treaties, but not on their own. They need to be approved by the Senate. And even, the Senate needs to work with the president as far as declaring war and things like that. So what we'll get into this year specifically in the Constitution is where are the powers shared, and then where do each branch kind of have their own specific spheres of influence. And understand that separation of powers is just saying we're going to break it up. Legislative as a sphere, executive as a different entity, and judicial as a different entity. That's the separation. The checks and balances is when they interact. So you would say this picture demonstrates separation of powers because they're divided up. And then you would say when they interact, when Congress passes a bill and the president signs it into law, but the Supreme Court said, actually, you're not allowed to do that, that's the checks and balances, right? So think of it more horizontal, okay? Separation of powers, horizontal, whereas think vertical, up and down, that's the federal system. So we're going to divide up the government horizontally. We're going to separate the powers. They're going to interact with each other. And also, we're going to create a more vertical division of government, and that's what we call the federal system. And so that's where you have national, state, and local. And so if we go back to your summer homework, in your summer homework, you were identifying conflicts within our division of power within our country. The checks and balances between branches, but then also the levels of government, and federalism is actually what we'll be covering in our next unit more specifically. But again, this is what at the Constitutional Convention, this is what they decided is how are we going to separate it out? How are we going to make sure that we divide up the power so that not one single entity can become a tyrant? So that we make sure that a king does not take over this country, and that the power is marked off and separated so much so it's fractured that it still works, but that no one can become too powerful. All right, almost done here. So let's look at the different sides, right? So we go into the deliberations of the Constitutional Convention because the articles are not working. We have a couple, types of thought here, schools of thought. You have the New Jersey plan, the Virginia plan. We come together, and then once we start getting the Constitution going, as in like the deliberations, we're starting to see some sort of resolution come together, then this is where the factions come in. And I say faction just as a group, right? Some groups we would call the Federalists. They are definitely in favor of this new Constitution. The Anti-Federalists were not as sold. They didn't feel it was enough to protect liberty and protect from a despot. But the Federalists understand Federalists pro-Constitution. People like Madison that really believe, I mean, he did write it, but really believe that this new Constitution is the way to do it. And again, because things were in private when they were creating the Constitution, no one knows what happened. And so the Federalist Papers is a very important media campaign. In a lot of ways, is a propaganda campaign to help citizens and important stakeholders within the American government to let them know that this is why this is a good system. And even though it has flaws, these are things that we can do to modify it. And so the context in history of the Federalist Papers, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, and James Madison writing these, this is to get people to understand this Constitution is a good thing. And eventually, I mean, the Federalists believed you don't need a Bill of Rights like the British Bill of Rights because so many of the freedoms that the government is not allowed to take away from you are assumed. They're in there. You may not be able to directly point to them, but in the totality of the interpretation of the document, we promise that the rights are there. And so eventually the Federalists, they do concede to the Anti-Federalists and eventually say, okay, we will offer a Bill of Rights, largely outlines defendants' rights. So what happens if you're arrested and things like that. But the Federalists largely got the Constitution ratified with what they had proposed. But the only major concession that you need to know about is with the Bill of Rights here. Okay, so some examples. And you guys are actually going to read through Fed 10 and Federalist 51. We'll read Federalist 78 with Alexander Hamilton when we get to the judiciary. But Fed 10, written by James Madison. Most of them are written by Alexander Hamilton, but the two that we're going to read for this unit are by Madison. And so Madison brings up the issues of factions. So this could be interpreted today as political parties, but it's really just groups of passion, groups of interest, as he describes it. And ultimately, factions are caused by difference in opinion. And he says, socioeconomic levels, different socioeconomic levels cause factions, cause different groups. And that's even what I'm just trying to show here. A banking system, that could, bankers could be a faction, government workers, and then different citizens, show this too. And with the factions, people have so many different ideas, and what we would say in the theory of democracy is that pluralist system is a good thing. We also talked about socioeconomic level, which I mentioned does lead to this cause in factions too. So what can we do? Can we destroy the factions? Can we get rid of them? I mean, Madison says no. It's impossible to get rid of them. So I guess the next best thing we could do, because we can't get rid of them, is by having a large republic, a large centralized government, and the branch that is the most important in that government is the congressional branch, right? The legislative branch that passes the laws. So say that's a different way. We cannot get rid of factions. We can't stop them from happening. They are caused by diversity of opinion and difference of socioeconomic levels. There's not much we can do about that, but we can control the factions. And the way we can control them to make sure that the factions don't cripple the government and cause gridlock is through a large republic that has a very strong legislative branch. And this is also why Article 1 of the Constitution is about the legislative branch, and it is the longest part of the Constitution. And that is largely represented by what Madison is talking about here in Fed 10. The other one that you guys will need to know, and especially for the AP test, is Federalist 51, also written by Madison. And this one really is trying to show the benefits or the thought process of having a separation of powers. And I would say, too, that this graphic that I put on the screen here is excellent. I think this will really help you for the Unit 1 exam, because not only does it show examples, but visually it's very easy to follow how they all intersect. And so Fed 51 really is talking about what happens if we separate the powers. And ultimately, if we separate the powers, we can have these checks and balances where some have some powers, but not everyone has all the powers. That's a major component of that. And then he also stresses the importance of independent elections, that we don't know the result, that they're counted fairly, that there's equity in voting and things like that. And so this is another component of Fed 51. And going into that too is really if the checks and balances and the separated powers are truly to be effective as theorized, ultimately you do need those independent elections. And to reiterate too, separation of powers are the circles. Okay, so the legislative branch, executive branch, judicial branch, those are the separated powers. The arrows, that's the checks and balances. Okay. Circles are the separated powers, but the arrows themselves, the arrows are the checks and balances. So which branch is most important? Well, according to Madison, it's the legislative branch. Congress should be the heart, so to speak. It should be, where everything is kind of running out of. And this is why so many of the powers of the president today are different, because you say, oh, well, maybe the executive branch is the most powerful. It might be. But at least the presidency as envisioned by the fathers, and if they were to see the presidency today, I don't know how thrilled they would be, but the legislative branch is the one that should be supreme, meaning the most important here. And oftentimes, things can cause gridlock, but if things can't get done within the legislative branch, because if you have one chamber of Congress, it's not going to work. So if we're going to make sure the legislative branch works, it has to be two branches. Or it has to be two chambers. That's what bicameral means, two chambers. So to sum this up, Fed 51 stresses the importance of independent elections. It shows the benefits of providing a limited democracy by separating the powers and having checks and balances. But within those separated powers, who should have the most power? Well, it should be Congress. But how do we prevent and make sure that Congress doesn't take over too much power? Bicameral legislature. And so through Fed 51 and really all the Federalist Papers, it's these individuals trying to show the public that has never seen any of this, that this is why it will work. And if not, we have an amendment process also. Okay. One last note, you guys are going to read a text called Brutus I. Brutus was an anti-federalist, and so it's going to call into question a couple of clauses like the necessary and proper clause and the commerce clause that we'll get into. But in general, just understand the two competing factions, the two original kind of parties here, the Federalists, who are pro-Constitution. What we've worked on the summer of 1787, is great. Even though it's not perfect, that's what we should go for. And the anti-Federalists say, you know what? This is not a limited government. This is not a government that is going to protect your freedom. And that's what matters. The only reason the government exists is to protect your freedoms. Otherwise, you know what? The government should not play a role. And one of the biggest parts is the lack of state sovereignty, that we're going to go with the message of the collective and not just what is in the minds of the states. And when you think of even the divisions within the colonies or the states at this point, the economies of the North compared to the economy of the South is just very different. And this is kind of an identity issue for the anti-federalists too, because they feel that another part of the country is deciding their interests when they should be able to. And This resentment is something that will persist when you talk about like John C. Calhoun and like nullification crisis and being able to have like this idea of state sovereignty and even choosing popular sovereignty. It's the idea of the identity of the states, and that while the federal government should be there to protect liberty, the state is really where the American identity lies. And I'm sure we can see that today too, right? So is it a limited government? Well, according to the Anti-Federalists and in the text by Brutus that we'll read, the answer is no. And so we looked at the main concession to improve this, to make sure that the rights of the people are protected, is with the Bill of Rights. And so the first 10 amendments of the United States Constitution are put into place. And that's kind of where I'll leave it for today. Feel free to go back and check certain parts of this lecture, and then what we'll do together as a class is we will go ahead and look at the different Federalist Papers. We're going to discuss Brutus 1, and then to kind of culminate, we're going to do a free response question that brings and synthesizes a lot of the Federalist versus Anti-Federalist ideas. All right.